relatively small part of the cemetery because we have really interesting stories all over the place, but we can't walk from the west end all the way down to the east end. So we're going to be focused on the west end, and the first one we're going to be doing is on the other side of section Y here. So we'll need to travel down there. And if I'm ever not speaking loud enough, just let me know. I'll try to project. I normally speak pretty loudly anyway, I'm told. But anybody have any questions before we start? We will have handouts afterwards if you guys want to take them home. And people can also use these as like a self-guided tour if they want. Somebody wants to just come out and do it on their own. There's maps to show where the graves are and some documents and stuff to kind of tell the story. So,
what's the date of the earliest graves?
Well, it opened in April or May of 1863 during the Civil War. The first 20 years, we don't have really thorough burial records. In 1883, the cemetery reorganized. The name was changed from Woodland to Riverside about that time as well. And from spring of 1883, summer of 1883, we have burial records in chronological order that were actually written at the time the burials took place. So they're pretty fascinating records. And the first one in there is an 8-month-old little girl who died of cholera. A couple pages later is an unknown adult male who died of a pistol shot through the head, which sounds straight out of the Old West. Nobody knows who he was. His family never knew what happened to him. This is maybe a little irreverent, but I think about that line in Dances with Wolves when they find the skull and the guy says, somebody back east is saying, why don't he write? This guy's family never knew what happened to him. We don't know who he is. I know where he's buried. There's no marker there. But those records are just fantastic, and that's where I find a lot of the stories is based on the cause of death. And we did find a newspaper article with the help of the library about that incident, and they believed he was shot on a train and pushed off the train because his body was found by the railroad tracks. Some pretty fascinating stories. I've been talking with the library about maybe doing another one of these in October because I have a huge fascination with, I have a healthcare background, so I have a huge fascination with the health issues and the causes of death, and particularly with the Spanish influenza epidemic. I always wondered how badly it hit Marshalltown, and we have about 75 Spanish influenza victims buried here, and some of their stories are incredible. I did a story on for the Pastimes, I don't know, a year ago or so on it, but a lot of those burials are in one or two particular sections, and we could do a history walk just on that incident. And it was 100 years ago this October when it was really at its worst, October, November. So we are a nonprofit organization. We're governed by a board of trustees that are unpaid volunteers. We're a perpetual care cemetery, and what that means is that when you buy space or burial plots here, a portion of what you pay gets put into a perpetual care trust fund. We can never use the balance in that fund. We can only use the interest off of it and once annual distribution to help us buy equipment and whatever. But that money is set aside so that when there's no more money coming in because the spaces are all sold and the burials are all done, we have a source of funds for snow removal and mowing and general infrastructure upkeep. It's not intended to take care of individual graves, but rather the cemetery as a whole. Not long after I started here, we found a letter from Nelson Ames, who was then mayor and commander of the Frank M. Thomas post of the GAR, which is an association of Civil War veterans. He was in the Civil War himself and was a hero at Gettysburg, and there is supposedly a plaque at Gettysburg in remembering Nelson Ames and his troops who defended a peach orchard at Gettysburg. The letter requested that the cemetery trustees provide a piece of ground for their members who didn't have another place to be buried, and it's in the handout so you can see that letter. We have it on the wall. We never knew what the response from the cemetery was. There wasn't a letter attached saying yes or no or whatever, but then we found a file for the Frank M. Thomas post of the GAR, and we were able to locate, so we know that this is the plot that they were given. They're all Civil War veterans. When I started here, none of these new markers were here. This man had a marker that you could hardly read anymore, and that one was sunk into the ground. You can see how far we raised it up. Frank M. Thomas himself was a Civil War veteran, and that's where apparently a highly respected one. I don't think he was a high rank or anything, but apparently he was respected enough that they named the post here after him. Thomas Cottamus right here is a former slave who came back to Marshalltown with the troops. He actually ended up serving in the military in a colored unit for the Union Army, so we were able to prove his service and get him a Civil War marker for his grave. We still have his old marker. It was a civilian grave that you couldn't read anymore, and as long as you can't read the marker, you're able to replace it with a veteran's one if you're able to prove the service. Josiah French was also a slave. He did not actually serve in the military. We believe he was a cook and took care of the uniforms and the horses for the men in this troop and that came back to Marshalltown. They both lived out their lives in Marshalltown. Josiah French and Thomas Cottamus's obituaries are in the handout, so you can actually see. Josiah French was a laborer who did work apparently for a lot of the prominent people in town, and the people who were his pallbearers at his funeral were some of the leading businessmen and leaders of the community, so obviously they were very highly respected, in addition to the fact that they were black men who were allowed to be buried in what was then a white section for veterans. Since Josiah French didn't serve, we weren't able to get a VA marker for him, but we had a story in the paper. Sarah Jordan did that, and there was somebody here from, I think, Pennsylvania out east on business with Emerson who read the story and called Sarah and offered to pay for a stone for him so that we could mark his grave. And Jerry McCann is a huge Civil War fan and a researcher, a history buff. He has done so much research. He was the one who did the research to allow us to get markers for some of these unmarked graves, to find the documents that proved they served, and he's the one who came up with "honored here by the soldiers whose hardships he shared," which I thought was a really neat quotation for Josiah French's stone. Josiah French was anywhere between 70 and 90 when he died. He didn't even know how old he was. He had a wife and children. He didn't know where they were. They thought his wife might have been in Leon, Iowa, and in the obituary it said they were making some inquiries, but we never could find anything more about that. I actually contacted somebody in Leon at the public library or historical society or something, and they did some initial research, and they did have a woman named French, a black woman named French there years ago, but we weren't able to definitely prove any kind of connection, so hard to say. Anyway, any of you heard of Elizabeth Cook Spears Gillette? She came to Marshalltown in the late 1850s, somewhere in 1850s or 60s, with her husband. They were newlyweds. He opened a jewelry store in town. She was the first woman to work in a dry goods store in Marshalltown. She befriended Johnny Green, who was the Potawatomi Indian chief who helped the early settlers here become acquainted and survive the winters and all of that. I think that Johnny Green had a bit of a crush on her because he called her the pretty squaw. I've never seen a picture of her, but we have a picture of her house. If any of you remember Eula May Flowers across from the hospital, the house behind it was Elizabeth Cook Spears Gillette's home. And we have a picture of that house, and there's a woman in long skirts sitting on the porch who could very well be her, but it's not close up enough to really get a good look at her. There was a project with the federal government where they were trying to get photographs of the Indian chiefs and all over the country, and they wanted to get photos of Johnny Green, and a lot of the Indians were hesitant to do that and suspicious of it, but Elizabeth talked Johnny Green into having his photograph taken. She pulled a blanket off the shelf in the dry goods store to have him wrap for the picture. He didn't want that. He wanted a white man's coat. This is according to the histories. And so they got a Prince Albert coat from a men's clothing store next door or whatever, and he wore that in the picture. We have a picture with him that's in here as well. A picture of Johnny Green, his wife, and a small child with him. Those are the only pictures we know of Johnny Green, and if it hadn't been for Elizabeth, we wouldn't have those pictures today. He's buried out at the Veterans Home, and they actually witched to find his grave, and there is a small marker there. He was supposedly buried on the bluffs overlooking the Iowa River in that area, and they did some witching, if you've heard of that, like they do for water, and put a marker on his grave. Pardon?
Dowsing?
Yes, dowsing. Elizabeth went on, she had an interest in healthcare and medicine. She went on to study medicine in Marshalltown under a doctor, and then went to Chicago and got her medical degree for what that was worth in the maybe 1880s. I mean, it wasn't anything like like it is today, but came back to Marshalltown and was one of the earliest doctors and probably one of the first 2 female doctors in town. Her practice was particularly focused on women and children's health. She and her husband had 2 or 3 boys, 2 of whom died young. At least one of them of a drug overdose, and he was in pharmacy school at the time, I believe. She ended up having problems, I believe, with dementia. She was tried for insanity. We actually have newspaper articles about people being brought before the courts for insanity, and frequently they were having mental problems or it was dementia. She ended up at the hospital in Independence, Iowa, and died there in 1928. The other cool thing about this marker, I mean, you notice it's a really small stone. Her grave was unmarked until just within the last 15 or 20 years. She also, I should backtrack a little. She was married. She had a second marriage later on to a man named Gillette, who ran the Western Union's office in Marshalltown. We were under the impression that her first husband had died, but we've since then found evidence that he might have still been living, and maybe they got divorced, but they didn't really always talk about divorces much back then. Her first husband's descendants found out about her and what her story in Marshalltown was. They don't even live here, and they paid to have that small stone put on her grave because they felt she was important to Marshalltown's history and her grave should be marked. I think that's awesome, especially considering she wasn't even married to him anymore when she died, and I mean, it's pretty cool. We put the base on there because I wanted to be able to put flowers on her grave because she's one of my favorite people here. Nicholas Messenger was a hero in Mississippi during the Civil War and helped to storm a fort at Vicksburg, and there is a monument there with his name and the name of some of his friends that were in his troop with him, and they had a particularly dramatic battle where they were able to take the fort. And I gotta get my things straight here. It has been called the Iwo Jima movement of the Civil War, and he was directly involved in it. He was badly wounded, came back to Marshalltown, served as postmaster, which was a very big thing in those days. I think they were even appointed by the President of the United States. He was so badly wounded that his legs didn't really work, and he was in a wheelchair and had an attendant who took him everywhere that he wanted to go. There is a complete full story in here with pictures of him. The flag that this 22nd Infantry Group from Iowa had at Vicksburg is in the possession of the Iowa State Historical Building, as is the sash that he wore on his uniform, I believe. So he was a pretty big deal in the Civil War years. And his home was the house on the southwest corner of West Main Street and 12th Street. It's a big stately home. They recently put new landscape stones and made a wall above the sidewalk. I used to live in that neighborhood, so I'm kind of familiar with it. But that house was Nicholas Messenger's house. It's really cool, I think, to find out where these people lived, especially if the home is still there. So he's a pretty big hero from the Civil War. Elliot Shirts was a lieutenant colonel with the 8th Iowa Cavalry. He was involved with the Battle of Shiloh and was officer of the day of the battle. He originally came to Marshalltown in the 1850s because he heard there was a lot of building going on, and he had carpentry skills. And that's what brought him here. He ended up fighting in the Civil War, was wounded in the war and held prisoner for a while. Eventually, I think that I might have read that he even escaped from prison. I don't find that in his obituary, but I believe I read that somewhere, and that he ended up rejoining the Union Army and fighting again, and then when the war ended, he came back here. He served also as postmaster for something like 16 years, I think. Was married 3 times, had children with all of his wives. I believe that he outlived them all. My favorite story about Elliot Shirts is told in, there's a book on Marshall County history written in 1868. It's only about this thick, because in 1868 there wasn't a lot of history to tell yet, but it was written by Nettie Sanford, who later married a Chapin, Nettie Sanford Chapin. She's also buried at Riverside and one of my heroes. Her book is wonderful and tells some great stories that are full of sadness and humor and drama, and I mean, she talks about a bunch of women raiding a saloon here in town and breaking up all the kegs and booting the owner out on the streets because too many of their menfolk were going to the bar and drinking. Elliot Shirts became the head of the local militia because of his war experiences and his ability in leading men. And this was about the time that, if you've heard of the fact that Marietta was once the town in Marshall County that was going to be the county, that was the county seat, and they had the county records there. There was a group of people in Marshalltown who thought Marshalltown should be the county seat, and it was about the time the railroad was going to come through as well, so, and the railroad bypassed Marietta, so it kind of made sense, but it was a big dispute over where the county seat was going to be. The actual county courthouse that was in Marietta is now the back portion of the Lincoln Apartments on West State Street. 610, I think, is the address. So that building is still existing. It was used as a store for a while, so I think it's moved several times. But Elliot Shirts led the Marshalltown troops, the militia, into Marietta to seize the county records and bring them to Marshalltown. They were successful, but the big battle ensued, and the story in Marshalltown was that the streets of Marietta were running red with blood over this whole issue. I mean, there was a lot of stuff. People were bribing people to vote for Marshalltown to be they were giving away guns and land and everything to get people to vote to have Marshalltown made or Marshall it would have been at the time probably. So anyway, the troops went there, and actually what happened was that a bunch of women and children and old men pelted them with rocks and eggs and vegetables and whatever. They got the records, they brought them to Marshalltown. That whole issue actually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that Marshalltown should be the county seat. So that's a story about how Marshalltown got to be the county seat. I really recommend that book by Nettie Sanford. I think the Historical Society still has them for sale, or you can get them online even. We have a copy here, and I think the library has one.
Library too. So.
Okay, there you go. I've heard that parts of that book are not entirely reliable, that it might have been sensationalized a little bit, but it's still wonderful reading. I'm just going to note that this Letts marker right here is the Letts family from the Letts Fletcher grocery business, and that was the business that had the Iowa Wholesale Building and senior residences that just got destroyed in the tornado. They were one of the families that started that company. They have a pretty interesting story too. Pardon? Oh, okay, I'll try. I don't want to stand on a monument. We just call this the pie section. It's a circular section. It's divided into 6 pie-shaped slices. 6 families in early Marshalltown each took one of the pie sections, and it has this big tall monument with their name, each of the 6 family names on the monument in their sections. This is not filled. There are actually spaces for sale here now. When we have family plots that were bought 125 years ago, and there are no family left, and there have been no activity in these plots for, I believe, 75 years. The cemetery has a right to reclaim them. It's a process where they have to advertise it and look for descendants of the family who might want these spaces still, but if they're successful at it, they can turn around and sell spaces in plots that were originally bought by somebody way back in the past. So there are actually spots for sale, and there is a map in here. The Stone family is on here. Boardmans owned a house on West Main and East Main and 3rd Avenue that was originally the front of the hospital, and they added on to the back of it to the south side. The brick portion that you see on 3rd Avenue was added onto that house, and eventually the house was torn down. It was a big Gothic, romantic looking building with turrets and all kinds of things, but there's information in the packet about the families involved here if you're interested. We're going to head over here. This is the William Cribbs family plot. It has Cribbs written on the top, which is pretty cool. These raised letters are neat, the way they did those. When I first found this, this marker and this marker were nowhere to be seen. So it was just Dell, the son, and I think that's the father. Yes. And it attracted my attention. I think I found it because we found his burial order, and he drowned he was a drowning victim in the Iowa River, just right back here somewhere around the dam, and he and some other young men were in a boat and went over the dam, and 2 of them were drowned. He was 20 or 22 years old, and I kind of didn't know about what happened to the mother and the little girl, who was 2, I think, when she died. And we ended up finding these markers underground. They had sunk into the ground so you couldn't even see them anymore. And so we raised them back up, and it was just a really cool day for me because I felt like I was reuniting a family because they had been separated, so to speak, for all these years. Just a kind of a poignant story that... This is Jean Seberg's family plot. Her parents are buried here. Her brother David is buried here. He's in front here. Yes, he was killed in a car accident at a young age. And right here is a marker for Nina Hart Gary, who died she lived August 23rd through 25th, 1970. There's information in the folder about it, but in recent years, the FBI has admitted that they planted rumors about Jean Seberg's baby being the child of a Black Panther member and therefore black. And I honestly remember my mother telling me that the rumor was the baby was black. She was not, and they had the funeral here and the burial here and had an open casket and took many pictures so that people could see the baby was not black. But there's a copy of a newspaper article where the FBI has since come out and said yes, they did target her and purposely plant rumors that the baby was black, and she was so distraught by this that she went into labor early and the baby didn't live, and possibly because of the emotional heartbreak she was going through at the time. And the story in the newspaper article is even that she attempted suicide every year on the baby's birth date. And eventually she was found dead in a car in 1979 in France. I don't know, maybe you know the story, but it's suspected that that may have been a suicide as well. But anyway, her baby's marker is here. I think it's kind of sad that she's in France and the baby's here, but at least the baby's with family. Yeah. She was involved with the Black Panthers and donating money to a school lunch program, and she was a philanthropist and was giving money to them to help them achieve their goals, and it was a civil rights era, and it wasn't appreciated by the powers that be, apparently. So this mausoleum was the first one to be built at Riverside. It is absolutely the most primitive. The other ones are pretty luxurious compared to this one. Catherine Swearengin was the wife of a Methodist minister who was reportedly afraid of being buried in the ground. So she ended up dying December 23rd, 1893. at the age of 61, I believe, and her husband, who was a Methodist minister. He had been the minister here for 2 years and was also in Gladbrook and I think Albion as well. He moved around a lot, just 2 years here and 2 years there. But they came back to be buried here. They had her body held in a receiving vault that used to sit here as well, that's since been torn down. They kept her body there over the winter. It was a really cold winter and they couldn't build the mausoleum until the spring, and then once that was built, they interred her in here. Her husband is next to her, and 7 or maybe 8 other relatives are buried here. Several of their children and a couple, 3 of their grandchildren. You will see 9 crypts in there. They have their names on the fronts of them. We also found a burial card for a 6-year-old little boy who died of croup in 1909, who, according to all our records, is buried in here, and there's no sign of him. We don't know what the story is, and we're still trying to figure that one out. We can't make any sense of it. His original burial order written at the time of his death says he was buried in the Swearengin Mausoleum, and we can't find him. See if you can find him. I found a couple of we have a burial card for every burial, so we have drawers in the office that have over 23,000 cards with the burial name, who their lot owner was, when they died, when their funeral was, sometimes cause of death. I found one, maybe 2 cards, for infants of Ellen and Albert, or Albert Wass, W-A-S-S, and there, most of the time, a lot of times those burial cards for really, in the burial orders for newborns and stillborn babies don't even give the sex of the child, and so we didn't know anything from those burial cards about these 2 babies, but when you come out and look at the marker, their names are on there, Bud and Blossom, which just struck me as such cool names for 2 little babies. One of them died the day after they were born, and one died the next day. And Bud and Blossom just seem really fitting and appropriate names for 2 little babies who never really got a chance to fully bloom, so to speak. And we have named our 2 newest white geese at the lake, Bud and Blossom. Babies. Good.
You're too heavy.
This monument was built in 1901 to honor and recognize Marshalltown's volunteer firemen and provide a place for them to be buried. There are, I believe, 19 former volunteer firemen buried here. I'm not sure what the last burial was. This is 66. Some of them are much, much earlier, 1903. The monument was in kind of poor shape, and in 2001, for the 100th anniversary of the dedication of this monument, the monument was rebuilt, renovated, fixed up, repaired, and then they had a rededication ceremony here honoring the volunteer fire department at the time. It's a pretty neat place. Okay. And there is information in here about that as well. Next up, this way. Probably my very favorite paragraph in Nettie Sanford's book on Marshalltown history tells about the first funeral, and I'm quoting her here. The first funeral in the village was that of a little daughter belonging to Mr. Silas Korn on the 10th of August, 1853. It was a gloomy hour to the family, for there was scarcely a word of ceremony. They parted the wild grass and the yellow autumn asters at the corner of Jack Brady's farm with no prayer or death song, but laid the little one to sleep in a pine coffin till the prophesied bright morn of the future. On the 10th of September following, her sister, a sweet child of 7 years, was placed beside her in the same primitive manner. There was not a professing Christian in the neighborhood. At this funeral, Mrs. John Smith, mother of Mrs. Rawls, remarked she could not rest easy thus buried, but in the following January she was interred in the same way. Mr. Caleb Brady also buried a child the next spring without a word of ceremony, no shroud, nothing but its tiny little calico slip for its grave cerements. And they drove away to the spot where the others found a resting place at a quick pace, and the last rites were soon dispatched by the family. That first little baby was Elizabeth Corn, 1853 to 1853. She died the same year she was born. And then Frances Putney was her actually half-sister, who died a month later and was buried. This Jack Brady's farm was where the Veterans Home is today, and the place that they buried these children was in the corner of a pasture or field or meadow or whatever. That land was eventually bought by a man named Hartwell, and it became known as the Hartwell Cemetery. The creek that runs through the Veterans Home grounds and 13th Street is still known as Brady Creek, after that farmer. And when it was decided that the Veterans Home, the Soldiers Home, as it was called then, was going to be built on that location, the bodies, 53 bodies, I believe, 58 bodies maybe, were manually dug up from that cemetery and brought to Riverside and buried right down in this area over here. 2 of the Corn family infants were buried there. So I've always wondered if they chose this plot because it overlooked where the 2 little girls were buried. I have no idea. It's just pure romantic speculation, but I like the idea of it. These were a very early pioneer family, obviously. I think the first settlers came in here in the very late 1840s, 48, 49. This was just 1853 when they came. They have put a plaque on the back here, remembering our ancestors, erected by great-grandsons Roland, Irwin, and Wilbert Corn, 2009. Another case where a family is honoring their ancestors that are buried here. And actually, all those names are the family members, but there's only these 2 burials here. And the 2 little girls that are somewhere over there, presumably.
You don't have record of where they are at?
There are 2 lots, 124 and 125, in one of these 2 sections down here. I haven't laid it out exactly where they are. These sections here are, for the most part, really old, and there are a lot of unmarked graves, and I doubt those people even had markers. I mean, they didn't have monument companies here in the 1850s, and it was probably, and unfortunately, I think these bodies were, the Veterans Home opened in 1886, which was 3 years after our records got really good, and we have nothing about individual names of those bodies that were brought here, so I suspect it was done before 1883. Haven't been able to find any. I've even contacted the Iowa State History Department, because their students getting a major in history have to do a major project in order to graduate, and I suggested to them that a great research project might be to find out more about these bodies that were moved. At the time when the Vets Home was built, they had to be planning this and moving these bodies, and are there records with the State Historical Society or anything? I don't know. And they seemed to be kind of interested, but it was in the spring of the year, last year, I think, and it wasn't the right timing, but they said they would keep it in mind, and I've heard nothing more, but I think that would be an awesome research project, just to find out who, I mean, we know who a few of them are from Nettie Sanford's book, and I had phone calls and numerous emails with Irv Corn, a family member, one of the great-grandsons who put the plot in here, and he was really helpful in writing the story about them and learning more about them. He said Silas and Sarah, his wife, were both widowers. They have both been widowed. Both of their spouses had been killed in the same epidemic of typhoid or something, and so when they met, they may have had similar experiences that might have drawn them together. Irv said that he hoped that they really loved each other, and that in his imagination he saw them meeting at a church picnic and falling in love after that and whatever. Frances was Silas's daughter from his first marriage, and then Elizabeth was Sarah and Silas's daughter together. Interesting family, and a really... This marker attracted my attention because of the statement on it, erected by her pupils. Abbie Gifford was a highly respected and successful teacher who taught in, according to her obituary, the there were apparently, Racine, Wisconsin had an excellent school system back then, and she taught there and came to Marshalltown and was a teacher here and highly respected and beloved apparently by her colleagues and her students and their families. Nettie Sanford helped to get her elected as the superintendent of schools for Marshall County, which I would think back then was probably pretty remarkable considering she was a female. She had a mother in Northwood, Iowa, and her brother was there, and I believe they were in poor health, and I think she served for 4 years as county superintendent, and then I think she retired early and went up to Northwood to help take care of her family. Her brother died in 1886 and is buried in this plot as well. I don't know that he's got a marker. She died just 4 years later in 1890, and her mother was still living and was in poor health herself and couldn't bring Abbie back for her burial, so she sent her with 2 friends on a train back to Marshalltown. Her students and colleagues and friends here in Marshalltown met her casket at the train station and escorted her body back up to the cemetery for burial. She arrived in town at 5:00 p.m. and they came and buried her straight away, I guess. And then all of her pupils paid to have this monument put on, which is a good-sized monument for its day. Probably cost a pretty penny. There is another burial in this plot called somebody named C. Gifford, who died in 1883. Was a male. We didn't know the first name. We did a little research, and it looks like it's Crowell Gifford, and we believe that was her father. He was born in 1801, so he would have been 80-some years old, and the timing is right. He would have been about 39 when she was born, so it all kind of makes sense. There were a couple other children. Her mother ended up going to California and died in California, and we believe she was living with another daughter. And she's not buried here, sadly. I think that's kind of unfortunate that the family couldn't be together, but Parker here went, oh my goodness, the first time we heard about Dr. Hiram Getz was in a story about a man who had immigrated to the United States from Great Britain. He was in his 40s. He was injured in a railroad accident, and both of his legs had to be amputated, and he had epilepsy. And he told the doctors, they brought it was over by State Center where the accident happened. They brought him to Marshalltown to the hospital. Dr. Getz actually had his own hospital here, and we believe that's where that was, because Marshalltown's first hospital wasn't built yet in this was back in the 1800s. He told the doctors that he didn't think he was going to survive. He was afraid he was going to have an epileptic seizure and die. He survived the surgery to have his legs removed and ended up in a seizure the next morning and died. And in his pocket they found a letter from his mother that she had obviously responded to a letter that he sent her, and apparently he hadn't been in touch with her in some time, and she was overjoyed in the letter to hear from him and get some word of where he was and what he was doing. And she told him the news of the family and the neighborhood and in England, and wanted him to write back and stay in touch with her, and that's how presumably they knew how to get a hold of his family. And the family ended up paying, his mother and his sister ended up paying for a monument on his grave. I mean, I think about that, being a mother of a son myself. And his father was a minister, and the monument they put up says that he's the father of the late Reverend John Carr. And it was like she was wanting people in this foreign land to know what her son was, and that he came from a good, educated family. And it's a beautiful little monument. And that's how I first heard of Dr. Getz. He treated this man. Dr. Getz he got his medical degree in Pennsylvania, I believe, and moved to Iowa. He did something at Grinnell College as well, but went into practice here, was one of the foremost surgeons and physicians in the whole state of Iowa, and even was known outside of the state, from what I understand. Had a beautiful practice. There's a picture in here of the building that his practice was in on East Main Street. It's no longer there. It's like a kind of like the brownstone houses that you see in the big cities in New York or something, and his practice was in there, and I believe they lived there as well. And he had a couple of kids, and one of them became a doctor and also was in practice with him, I believe. He helped to treat patients during the 1903 typhoid epidemic in Marshalltown, which was caused by water from the river, contaminated water getting into the city water supply. And that's when they first built the water treatment center and put a sewer system in and all of that here in Marshalltown. We have another man buried here who's got a really fascinating story that was done in one of our history walks before, but who was involved in the building of that. But he was treating patients day and night and day and night, and in order to keep going, took morphine as a stimulant, and then ended up, sadly, with a terrible addiction to morphine. I have a hard time imagining morphine as a stimulant, because I think of that as something that would be a sedative, in effect, rather than something to keep him going. But anyway, he was tried for insanity again a couple of times. At one point he was in Omaha and was seriously depressed and despondent and suicidal, and ended up being tried for insanity. That was the second one. The first one, he was sent to Independence and was treated there for his mental problems and maybe the drug addiction, and he successfully completed that, got out, and was doing okay for a while, and then it all fell down again, and he ended up on trial again for insanity. He was on a train station platform in West Liberty, Iowa, and the town marshal was trying to arrest him because he was having a psychotic episode, and he had a scalpel and he was scaring people, and he ended up attempting to commit suicide by plunging the scalpel into his chest. He was taken to the hospital in Iowa City, recovered, and then ended up moving down south, was in Tennessee for a while, and ended up finally in Jacksonville, Florida. Is it Jacksonville? Yeah. And then his life pretty much spiraled out of control. They found his unconscious body in a room on Main Street in Jacksonville with a small stash of morphine and just a few things there. He was unconscious. They took him to the hospital. He never recovered consciousness and died. And then he was brought back to Marshalltown for burial. Really dramatic, sad story for a man who had so much potential and promise and had been so successful in his early life. He'll be our next story in the Pastimes next month. I just got more information about him, and there's information in. This is one of my all-time favorite stories from the cemetery. The Binford family, everybody's probably heard of. The Binford house that houses the Federated Women's Clubs of Marshalltown was the Binford family home, Thaddeus Binford. There's another interesting story just to throw out there. We have a burial record for an infant who was found in the Binford family's hog lot. We don't know a lot of detail. We don't know what the story was there. We were kind of freaking out when we first found it, thinking, because Mrs. Binford, Thaddeus's wife, had a baby just about that time, and they also had two daughters who could have had a pregnancy or whatever, but we were able to prove that the Binford's young daughter did survive into adulthood, and I think that it might be that a hired hand or somebody like that had a baby and buried the baby there to hide the, I don't know, we don't know what the story is. Anyway, in the early morning hours on a May day in 1894, I believe it was, Sam Ruby, who was the superintendent of the cemetery here for 50 years, from early 1890s to when he died in the 1940s. He's the man who did all the landscaping of the cemetery. This was his place. He was the father of this cemetery. He drove into work and found a body laying face down on Mamie Binford's grave, right there. In evening dress clothing. It turned out to be the body of William Wallace, who was a photographer, had a photography business here in town. Mamie had just died in February of that same year of a typhoid malarial fever type thing, which was the same cause of death as one of her sisters who died in '87 or something like that. She was quite ill for some time. There were newspaper articles that went into a great amount of detail about her illness, and anyway, she died in February, and Mamie and William Wallace had been in the same circle of friends. They were big in social circles. It made a point in the newspaper article of saying that although they were friends and ran in the same circles, and they implied that he wanted a relationship with her, she had never accepted him as her suitor. And it appears that he had developed a real fascination or love or whatever for Mamie, and when she died, he had always been kind of emotional anyway. It appeared his business started to fail. He was having financial problems. He was despondent and depressed. He actually spoke to a minister at the Methodist Church about some scripture that gave him hope that if you died of a suicide, that you still had a chance of going to heaven, because they think that he was maybe planning this and investigating what might be the result if he committed suicide, if he would be able to go to heaven and be with Mamie, and is the speculation. He dressed up that evening before this happened, went to the Tremont house and had a cup of strong tea that they said he downed quickly. He told the waiter or whatever goodbye when he left. He went and got some stamps that they believe then he put on 6 or so letters that he had in his pocket that they found on him when they found his body. They were letters to Mamie's father, Thaddeus, to his office person in his photography business, to a paper reporter at the Times Republican, and to a couple other people, I think. I would love to see that letter to Mamie's father. They did quote the letter to the newspaper reporter, and he thanked him for past courtesies and told him something to the effect of, "I'm mad tonight, but I'm going to be free soon," and he signed it wearily, William Wallace. He had requested to be buried here, but his mother lived in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, I think, and his body was returned there for burial. I have fantasies about contacting the cemeteries there and seeing if they can find William Wallace's grave and send me a picture of it and share the story of how he died here, because I wonder if they even have it. Maybe they don't care, I don't know, but I do.
Yeah.
Cool. When I first found out about this story, I was shocked. I found it in an article that was printed 25 years later in the newspaper. It was 25 years ago in Marshalltown, and they reprinted stories from 25 years previously, and that's how I discovered the story. And I actually ended up talking to a couple of people who have been heavily involved with the Binford house and the Binford family's history, and none of them had ever heard this story before. They didn't know it. In fact, Mamie was even one of the characters that was represented in one of the old history and reenactments that they did years ago here. And nobody had ever heard this story, and we just accidentally found it in looking at old newspaper records.
Very cool.
I kind of hope William found his peace afterwards, but sad story. He was rather handsome too.
And so Mamie never got married?
No, she was 25, I think, when she died, 25, 26. A whole article about her, not really an obituary, but more like a commentary article about Mamie, just praising her glories after she died, and what a remarkable one. She was supposedly a really intellectual, near genius, and she had traveled the world and was highly educated and beloved and charming, and I mean, they couldn't say enough good about her. I tried to find a picture of her. There's nothing at the Binford house, and apparently the Binfords weren't big on having photographs taken. It would have been so neat to have found her picture. The only other suggestion I had was to find out Jesse Binford's records are held at a university in Chicago, I think, and somebody suggested maybe I contact them and find out if they have a picture of her. And I haven't done it yet, but it would be so neat to follow up on that. Any questions?
Does
Did they ever say what he died of? I mean,
Poison.
oh, he it was
Poisoned
poison,
himself,
okay.
yeah.
He poisoned him
Yeah.
and just came and laid
I
on
think
her
they
grave.
found a vial of something laying next to him, and I mean the newspaper article, they're very graphic in those days, and they describe his body and everything, you know, every mark on it, and a lot of the obituaries, especially in the 1860s, and back, were extraordinarily flowery in their language and very poetic, unlike the very matter-of-fact way we have of writing now. They're pretty interesting, and it's in here. You guys can read it when you get the handouts.
I have questions.
I would have had time for another couple more.
Is this a public cemetery or private cemetery?
It's not owned by the city. We get no city funding. We get no county or state funding. It's, I guess you'd say, private. It's owned by the lot owners. The people who own the spaces are technically the owners. They have the right to vote for the board of directors, board of trustees. There's a board of trustees, 7 members who govern the cemetery. Any other questions? I really thought this was going to run longer.
This is not a cemetery that's straight on row on row on row.
No, it's not.
Clusters. So was that by design, or is that it just happened?
Sam Ruby was raised in Wisconsin, and he loved the out of doors. And we have a magazine article that was written in 1926, I think, 28, somewhere in there. The American Magazine, which was a nationwide magazine, and someone in Des Moines wrote to one of the writers for this magazine and told her about this cemetery and how people come here kids come here to play, and it's a place for the living and whatever. And this woman that she wrote to was intrigued by the idea because it was just such a different view of a cemetery from what she was used to. She actually traveled to Iowa, came here and got a grand tour from Sam Ruby and interviewed him, and there are quotations in there where one of them is just beautiful. I learned to love the curve of the road and the glimpse of the water in the distance, and yeah, he built this around the lay of the land. Marshalltown had a landscape architect here who was involved with this North 3rd Avenue, what they're going to do to change that, and he took one look at the cemetery and asked if this was designed by a landscape architect, because he said it was so obvious that he could tell right away.
Oh, wow.
We got a copy of that article from that magazine from the library. Thank you, library. It's several pages long and pretty involved, and she talks about this being probably the only cemetery in the world that has a lover's lane, because there was a map that actually had lover's lane on it. We can't find that map. Oh, I'd give my teeth to find that map. But anyway, and how people come here, and that it's made for the living and not just the dead, and not to be a sad place, but a place to embrace life and whatever. It's a pretty cool article, and that's what it is. I mean, this is a park here more than a cemetery. I know somebody who had friends in Des Moines who said to him, "You people in Marshalltown are weird. You treat your cemetery like it's a park," and I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
So. The pond, have you all heard how the pond was built? It was too marshy to bury anyone there, so Sam Ruby decided we should just make a pond here, I guess, and he had clay hauled in from, we hear, Blue Earth, Minnesota, by rail, I believe, and then they put straw down on, they piled the clay in there, put straw down on it, and then they rented a bunch of pigs from a farmer, brought the pigs in to trample down the clay and straw, and that's what formed the lining for the pond. Oh, wow. Supposedly we still have a receipt for the hog rental, and I've never found that yet either. I'm dying to find that, but dying, that's a good word to use. Anyway, so that formed the lining for the lake that is still there today, and when they renovated and redid the lake and put the wall up and stuff, they had to be very careful not to damage that, because that's what keeps the water in. And at one time, I'm told that it was like 15 or 18 feet deep.
Oh, wow.
And we believe now it's more like 10 or 12.
I was just, how deep is it? I didn't realize it was even that deep. I thought
Yeah.
it was like 2 or 3.
Oh no.
No, it's more than that.
The geese just came on their own for
I
the
had
most
no
part.
idea.
The Canada geese do, although we have a few that are permanent residents because they can't fly. They've got angel wing disease and their wings aren't right.
No goose
Yeah.
geese just.
I've
Pardon?
taken pictures of some of them.
The domestic ones we've gotten from people or
And they just
people
died
who've left
recently.
here or whatever, and we've
Yeah.
taken them in. And
Do you have any updates on the swans that I know you were trying to get?
Bob was cremated. We have him in a little box in the cabinet, the china cabinet in the office yet. We're going to bury him beside the lake over there next to where Goosey Goose is buried.
Oh, no, I
We-
meant because you said you were trying to
Oh,
get
for
new-
replacing him?
Yeah.
I emailed Mike Stegman back before it was probably back in June, before the tornado hit or anything, and he's got to get a hold of a guy with the DNR who heads up the program for trumpeter swans, which is what we might get. Their biggest concern about the trumpeter swans is that even if their wings are pinned and they can't fly, they have a tendency to wander during migration periods, and in our back we don't have a fence and the river's back there, and if they happen to wander off that far and end up in the river, we might not have them back. So that's all got to be investigated. I need to get a hold of him and we need to kind of get moving on that. But trumpeter swans are bigger and have a call that sounds like a trumpet that I don't think would be annoying in the neighborhood. I don't think it's that loud, but and they're also supposed to be less aggressive than mute swans. They hold their necks more erect, more straight up, not that like half a heart-shaped thing. And they have black beaks and black feet and stuff instead of the, bright orangey color that mute swans have. Mute swans are not native to the Americas, and they're destroying habitat from the Great Lakes to New England, and they don't really want they don't want to promote more mute swans. Mute swans are in England are all property of the Crown. Nobody owns them. The Crown owns all the swans in
That's
Great Britain,
interesting.
which I thought was fascinating. But
Polish needs to come and
so anyway,
the rest
the DNR and Conservation Board really would prefer that if we do anything, that we get a mute trumpeter swans because they're native and they're trying very hard to reintroduce them. The last ones died off in the 1880s or 90s, and there haven't been any at all in Iowa until they started this program, and in the 1990s, I think, they finally succeeded in having some nesting pairs here, and they're just
So what
been
were the ones in
expanding
Ames? Were those mute swans?
that. In Ames where?
At I remember
out the
when I
university?
was in school. Yeah.
Those are mute swans.
I just remember they were mean buggers.
Greencastle has.
Yes, there are a couple of them at Greencastle Lake. And I don't know if that lake has I've been there, but it's been a while ago. Is it fenced in? Okay. Gosh, so I hope that fence issue in the river doesn't
They have a gate that's just a pipe.
interfere. And the other advantage to them is that they would come out of Washington State, and we would only have to pay $300 or $400 in their airfare to get them to Des Moines. Mike Stegman said that he would personally go pick them up in Des Moines and bring them here. Whereas if we got mute swans, we could be talking a couple $1,000. So.
Oh my gosh.
Would it cost that much to fence in that part?
Oh yeah. We're looking at just replacing the fence down there and Babyland and the Garden of Time, and we're talking $20,000. I think nobody really wants to do it because unfortunately the graves are so close to the fence, and then right behind the fence is a concrete rubble has been laid there, and the air conditioning place is there, and there's a slope, and we're having a hard time finding anybody even willing to replace it. And that's like 400 feet, and we're talking a huge amount of money, and this is on the bluffs and rough country and underbrush and trees and everything, so it would not be easy to do.
The road that's in the back, that's all grassed over, was that just the road that you guys let be, or?
Those have just always been grass roads. They don't have enough traffic that driving on them, there isn't enough driving on them to damage the grass, and that's just the way they've always been, is my understanding. I don't believe there's any concrete under there. it's so expensive to maintain roads that I really kind of wish we had more roads that were like that, because it's just mow them and be done, you know. And
There's more.
in some of our roads that are more well traveled and that have been here a long time, we've got road repairs, and jeepers, 5-6 years ago the estimate to redo the roads was $370,000 or something, and some of it's a washboard. I mean, you lead a funeral procession in and it's thunk, 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 you know.
It must take a long time to get all this mowed.
By the time you get it mowed, the first part you mowed is already needs, especially in the spring, it's practically impossible to keep up. Yeah, they start at one end and finish it up, and then they start all over again. And we got, for the most part, 2 guys, 3 maybe, that do nothing but mow.
Do any of the families come out? And
Occasionally we'll
maintain
see families
the
with
area?
a trimmer trimming around the graves. It doesn't happen a whole lot, but some of them do. I hope they're doing it to help us and not that they're angry and upset. I mean, they don't come in and say anything
Just
to
looking at
us, but
this, it has to be a groundskeeper's, just, yeah, they got to
Yeah,
be
it's huge.
screaming about mowing. I mean,
we have
doing
to,
it all day
we
long.
try to replace our mowers every 2 years because, I mean, they run basically 35 hours a week every week unless the weather's bad, but, and maybe more than that some weeks, so.
Yeah, 'cause he's here
And all
on
the
a
monuments
Saturday.
that you gotta, it's a obstacle course, you know.
There's a reason they have the ones that are just plaque these days,
Yeah.
so they can go right over
Yeah.
it.
Yeah,
for
they
mowing.
do that.
I don't like
Those grave markers aren't nearly as much fun though.
I like
I do too.
Uh,
And you look at that one down there, Helen, with the raised letters.
Mm-hmm.
To do that today, we had somebody buy a marker for a family member, and it was probably about that same size. He was wanting to match other older graves in the family plot. The engraving cost more than the granite did because it's raised and it's reversed, hand chiseled and whatever. I think they machine chisel it now, but it's much more expensive than engraving it into the stone.
I went to a cemetery. I just got back from Hawaii and Oahu, and they have one of the cemeteries there that's just amazing.
I bet.
They've got an actual temple on site. You know, it's
Cool. The cemeteries in the deserts always,
yeah.
they just look so different from cemeteries up here. You know, there's not a bit of green on them. It's just sand and rock and granite, and I guess it's what you're used to. That's the tree over there that the geese always, we haven't cut that tree down either because the geese nest in that tree every year. And Sam Ruby's grave is right beneath that. James Dunn is the man who put the water treatment center in and put in the first sewer line from State Street up 3rd Street to basically Center Street here by the cemetery. The trolley cars used to come up here, and that at 3rd Street and Center was the last stop for the trolley cars, and we have a walkout gate there, and I always wondered why that gate was there, and then I finally figured out it was there so that people could get off the trolley car at the last stop and come into the grounds without having to walk another 3 blocks down here to get to the main gate. Anyway, James Dunn put that in. He got a loan from, he worked for the Short Hills, whose monument is right there. He got a business loan from Henry Anson, started his own construction company, did that water treatment plant, and then moved on to Chicago and Cincinnati and whatever, and did some major construction projects, railroads and roads and I don't know what all. Became a self-made millionaire, was interested in baseball, and bought the Cleveland Indians in about 1916, and they won the championship or whatever. I'm not a baseball follower, so in 1920 or 22 under his ownership, and he was beloved in the baseball world. His friends and mourners from Chicago rented a train, 3 cars on a train with a 4th car for mourners. The 4th car was full of flowers. The first 3 cars were mourners from Chicago and Cleveland who took the train and came to Marshalltown for his funeral and his burial. His burial was reportedly the largest one ever here. They had a couple of thousand people in attendance. The police monitored the gate. They only let the funeral procession in because there were too many vehicles to let everybody in. He was quite the man. His wife inherited the team, was only the second female owner of a professional ball club in the country, and she later sold the team for $1 million.
This was Jansen or
Dunn.
Done.
Control of the sewer line guy?
Huh?
The sewer line guy owned it too?
Yeah. He made it rich in construction and then loved baseball, so he bought the Cleveland Indians.
That was Don.
His wife is buried there too. She remarried, I think, but was still buried here when she died.
Is Henry Anson out there?
Yes, he's on Founders Hill,
Oh, okay.
which is up here. There's a Woodbury monument that looks kind of like the Helberg one, the tall obelisk, only it's in like a red granite that was imported from Sweden. And they brought it here by train and hauled it up to the cemetery. It's tall. I mean, it's not as tall as that one, but I wonder about how they got that up there and how they built
Wow,
it.
yeah.
The Woodburys are there, and then Henry Anson's family plot is right next to it.
The stone marker for Henry Anson, the date he died is not...
It's incorrect.
Yeah, I'm going to say it's not the same as on the statue downtown. And we noticed that we were doing some research, and I thought, okay, which one's right? You'd think the one on the stone was right. But
I
it's
think
not.
the stone is wrong because two family members, a nephew and the son, or somebody or other, or his brother and a son, or something or other, supposedly had an agreement to purchase his stone and share the cost. And it went some time, and I think it was a few years before it actually got set. But they ended up in a dispute over who was to pay for it or whatever, and it actually sat at the train station in storage for a year or something. And this was enough later that they just got the wrong date on his marker. I mean,
What's the difference in time?
I think it's just a year
It's
off
just
or
a year off.
something like that.
but-
We have a Thomas Cahill in the Catholic 1 section who was an old miser of a guy who never married and was just a laborer, but he saved up a ton of money, and he had thousands of dollars in his estate when he got sick, went to the hospital, St. Thomas Hospital, and it was quite a little amount of money for someone he lived on North Center Street. The house is still there. They ended up with a nurse at the hospital claiming that he left her his money, that he wrote a will giving it to her, but there was also an earlier will, and then the second will was supposed to supersede the other one, and so there was, and then another person showed up who said that his sister in Ireland should get the money, and it took several years for this to go through the courts, and he didn't want the Catholic Church. He was an Irishman who didn't like the church anymore. He didn't want the Catholic Church getting his money. And he came right out and said that. They had a judge from the city come and talk to him to try and convince him to make arrangements because they knew he was not going to live long. And he finally agreed to give it to the nuns at the hospital. And that's what the courts decided to do. And the nuns actually bought him a monument that's like, it's a good-sized monument, but it has the wrong date for his death as well. I mean, by the time they ironed out all the legal things, it was like 4 years later, and they got the date wrong. Another interesting story.